January 25th, 1990. Avianca Flight 052 is on approach to JFK. The Boeing 707 has been in the air for nearly 6 hours, holding over New York, fighting weather, delays, and now, something worse. Fuel is running out, fast. But there's no fire, no smoke, no alarm. Just 4 engines slowly starving. Inside the cockpit, the crew knows the numbers are bad, but they never say the word. No Mayday, no emergency, just quiet hints. Priority. Running low. Trying again. A TC doesn't see the urgency. The system treats it like just another flight, but this one isn't coming back. In the next few minutes, Avianca 052 will lose all power, all engines, and crash into a quiet New York neighborhood. No warning, no thrust, no second chance. And the most haunting part? It didn't have to happen. This is Inside Aero Disasters, and the story of a flight that never declared the emergency until it was already too late. At 9:03 p.m., Avianca Flight 052 was cleared to descend to 2,000 feet. The crew was setting up for an ILS approach to runway 22 left at JFK. Visibility, 1/4 mile. Ceiling, 200 feet. Surface wind, 21 knots from 190. The weather was legal for landing, but barely. Inside the cockpit, flaps were extended, approach speed stabilized, and the glide slope signal was confirmed alive. At 9:20, the aircraft was cleared to land. But something was already wrong. They were low on fuel, critically low. The gauges showed dangerously limited reserves. The engineer had not declared a fuel emergency. The first officer hadn't used the word emergency. ATC had no reason to escalate. As the aircraft descended through 1,000 feet, the glide path became unstable. Too low, then too high, then back down again. Wind shear warnings triggered. The ground proximity warning system began calling out, "Whoop, whoop, pull up," 11 times. At 9:23, the captain initiated a missed approach. Landing gear retracted, power added. The 707 climbed. Then came the final request, "Tell them we're in an emergency." It was too late. At 9:24 p.m., Avianca 052 began its go-round. The JFK tower instructed the crew to climb to 2,000 feet and turn left. They complied. Seconds later, the captain repeated his request to declare an emergency. The first officer acknowledged, but again, no standard emergency phrase was used. No Mayday, no fuel emergency. Just, "We're running out of fuel." ATC acknowledged the call, but kept vectoring the aircraft as routine traffic. They were assigned 3,000 feet, then instructed to turn northeast, then told they'd be sequenced behind another aircraft. At 9:32 p.m., inside the cockpit, the engine instruments began to drop. The flight engineer called it first. "Flame out, engine 4. 1 second later, "Flame out, engine 3. Fuel starvation had begun. The essential power bus switched. Systems degraded. The captain stayed focused, but it was no longer a controlled flight. At 9:33, the last transmission was made. They were cleared for another approach, but it was already too late. Seconds later, the cockpit voice recorder stopped recording. Electrical power was gone. At 9:34 p.m., Avianca Flight 052 lost all remaining power. All 4 Pratt & Whitney JT3D engines had flamed out. The aircraft was now a 300,000-pound glider, descending in silence through darkness and fog. No lights, no thrust, no hydraulic assist. There was no Mayday. There was no radar tag warning controllers. Only a final question from ATC. "You have enough fuel to make it to the airport?" No answer came. At 9:34:30, the aircraft clipped trees on a wooded hillside in Cove Neck, New York, 20 miles from JFK. The Boeing 707 broke apart on impact. The forward fuselage tore off. The cockpit and front cabin were thrown over the ridge. The rest of the fuselage fragmented, scattering debris across a steep 24-degree slope. The wings fractured. The tail remained intact. There was no post-crash fire because there was no fuel left to ignite. 73 people died on impact or from injuries sustained in the crash. 85 survived, many with life-altering injuries. The cockpit was destroyed. All 3 flight crew members were killed. Only 1 flight attendant survived. The impact site was a wooded residential area in Cove Neck, accessible only by a narrow road. Local residents called 911 within minutes. The first responder was a paramedic who lived half a mile away. He found passengers still strapped in their seats, some unconscious, many calling for help. Emergency response was massive, but immediately strained. Over 700 police officers and dozens of fire and medical units arrived. Traffic gridlock blocked access. Fog grounded helicopters. Communication lines overloaded. Rescue teams abandoned vehicles and approached on foot. 2 triage zones and a makeshift morgue were set up on the property of the McEnroe family, 500 feet from the wreckage. Critically injured survivors were tagged for priority evacuation. Many were not moved until nearly 2 hours after the crash. Several hospitals received patients without accurate reports from the scene. Radio traffic was jammed, and some responders received updates from television, not command. Rescue helicopters began evacuating at 11:30 p.m., nearly 2 hours after impact. 21 people were airlifted. 3 of the initially rescued passengers died from their injuries. At least 1 baby was found alive under wreckage hours later. By 3:30 a.m., all survivors had been transported to area hospitals. Investigators from the NTSB arrived within hours. The cockpit voice recorder was recovered intact. The flight data recorder, an outdated foil model, was found to be inoperative, taped down prior to the flight. It captured no useful data. Wreckage analysis showed no structural failure. All flight control surfaces were connected. Flaps were set at 14 degrees, slats extended. Gear was down at impact. There was no evidence of mechanical failure. All 4 engines were confirmed to be producing 0 thrust at the time of impact. Fuel starvation was the primary cause. The aircraft had been dispatched from Medellin with a total fuel load of 78,000 pounds, more than the required minimum. But nearly an hour of holding, delays, and 1 missed approach consumed all available fuel reserves. Flight 052 never declared a fuel emergency using proper terminology. The crew used phrases like running out of fuel and priority, but never said emergency or mayday. Controllers treated the flight as routine. ATC performance was reviewed. No procedural violations were found. Controllers acted within regulations based on the language used by the flight crew. The CVR painted a picture of an overwhelmed flight deck. The captain requested emergency action multiple times, but the first officer never escalated beyond soft phrasing. Priority, running out, never mayday, never fuel emergency. Crew coordination faltered. ATC calls were misinterpreted. Checklist discipline broke down under stress. Critical fuel math was skipped. There was no final briefing. No go-around fuel reserve calculated. No system of cross-checks enforced. Boston, the alternate, became unreachable, but the crew had no verified contingency. The engineer failed to flag threshold fuel figures. No call was made to dispatch. No final minimums were discussed. It wasn't one error. It was fragmentation. 3 trained professionals, each working, but never fully connected. The result, a cockpit operating in isolation from both procedure and reality. The NTSB identified no failure in engines, airframe, or flight control. The crash wasn't mechanical, it was systemic. Avianca dispatch cleared the flight using outdated forecasts. There was no live monitoring once the aircraft left Colombian airspace. No in-flight coordination, no weather updates, no adaptive reroute planning. Meanwhile, ATC handled Flight 052 by the book. Clearances were given, headings were assigned, but nothing in the system flagged the aircraft as high risk because no official fuel emergency was ever declared. The core flaw, procedural ambiguity. Avianca's manuals emphasized priority as a fuel alert. The FAA ignored it. Their controllers were trained to act only on mayday, pan, or emergency. No other term triggered action. There was no shared glossary, no built-in safety net for linguistic mismatch, no enforcement of international phraseology in domestic airspace. What failed wasn't just communication, it was recognition. And what followed wasn't delay, it was silence, institutionalized. Avianca Flight 052 didn't crash because of weather or engines. It crashed because no one said the word. Emergency. Fuel ran out. Communication broke down. and a preventable tragedy became irreversible. Let this flight be remembered, not just for how it ended, but for what it taught us about clarity, timing, and the cost of silence. If this story left you stunned, like the video and subscribe to Inside Aero Disasters for more real cases where seconds and words decide everything.